Leaders and campaigners around the world are blaming the reported death of Russia's most prominent opposition figure on President Vladimir Putin. Authorities say Alexei Navalny died after collapsing at the remote penal colony where he was serving a 19-year sentence. Supporters have staged vigils in many cities. Heads of state, including US President Joe Biden, have condemned the Kremlin and praised Navalny's courage and resilience.
Just one day before his death was reported, Alexei Navalny appeared cheerful as he gave testimony via video link from prison. The next day, Russian state TV read out the official announcement from the Federal Penitentiary Service that Navalny had fallen ill after going for a walk and lost consciousness. An ambulance crew tried to resuscitate him, but they couldn't save him. Navalny was transferred to a prison colony above the Arctic Circle in December. It's considered one of Russia's toughest prisons, and he has regularly been held in solitary confinement. Navalny's team said his lawyer will visit the prison on Saturday to confirm his death. Navalny's wife, Yulia, was attending the Munich security conference when the news reached her.
Но если это правда,
if this is true, I want Putin and all of his entourage, Putin's friends and his government to know that they will be held accountable for what they have done to our country, to my family, and to my husband.
In cities across Russia and around the world, mourners are paying tribute to the Kremlin's most vocal critic. In Moscow, people lay flowers at the Wall of Sorrow, a memorial to victims of political repression.
I don't know. It's kind of a shock right now. It's even hard for me to speak now. We loved him.
Of course, Navalny is a symbol. First of all, a symbol of opposition, a symbol of hope for a brighter future for Russia. And there's a feeling that with his death, this hope dies. If there had still been any hope left, it is even less now than it was before.
You begin to have a desire to leave Russia because you stop believing in positive change.
That dwindling hope on show as a protester is detained seconds after holding up a sign at a memorial. But Navalny's supporters are split between sorrow for the loss of their greatest hope and resolve that news of his death will only embolden opposition to the Russian regime.
DW's Yuri Reshetto heads our bureau in Riga, Latvia, and I asked him whether there's any confirmation of Navalny's death beyond the Russian prison service.
No, we only have official statements from the Russian prison service and reports from media, both pro-Kremlin state media and independent media. However, Navalny's team hasn't confirmed his death. We've tried to contact the director of his foundation, unfortunately without success. The only thing Navalny's press secretary has said is that his lawyer is on his way to prison in the Russian north. Nevertheless, this is already huge news in Russia. Some Russians are already bringing flowers to the monuments of politically persecuted people in different cities. People have also taken to the streets abroad to commemorate Navalny worldwide, in Berlin in front of the Russian embassy and in London. And here in Riga in Latvia there was also a spontaneous rally in front of the Russian embassy.
Navalny was moved to a prison colony in the Arctic in December. Can you tell us about the conditions that he was subjected to there?
Well, we know little about the prison conditions exactly in prison camp number 3 in Yamalo-Nenetsk in the Russian Arctic, where Navalny was held. But we do know that this prison in particular is considered to be a particularly harsh one. It's said to be a camp for particularly bad criminals that is difficult to reach from the outside world. The air temperature there is extremely cold. When Navalny was transferred there a few months ago from another prison in central Russia, he joked that the air was very frosty but clean. What we do know is that Alexei Navalny has been punished extra harshly 27 times during his imprisonment since 2021, when he was transferred to a solitary cell, the so-called punishment isolator, for several days. Cautious criticism, therefore, came from the Russian Human Rights Council today. One member dared to suspect that Navalny's detention conditions were ultimately destroying his health.
That was DW's Yuri Rochetto, and we can speak now to Catherine Belton. She's a writer and journalist who specialises in Russian politics and reports for The Washington Post. Catherine, thanks so much for your time. What do you make of the circumstances of Alexei Navalny's death in prison?
It's a terrible tragedy. Really, it was needless. If he did die at the hands of the Russian authorities, then this was a needless death. He was packed away to this faraway prison, as you said, in December. This was shortly after his opposition group had placed billboards in Moscow offering protests to the presidential elections. The billboards were there under cover of Happy New Year signs across Moscow. But if you clicked on the QR code on these billboards, you'd get to a website calling on you to vote against Putin. There was a website called Russia Without Putin. And shortly after those billboards appeared, Navalny was whisked away to this far-off prison cell above the Arctic Circle. And really, unfortunately, since he's been in jail since 2021 and been out of the media space, he'd really actually been eliminated quite tragically already from the political field. There was no need to do anything with him. Indeed, I've been speaking to opposition figures. They say, look, we don't know what happened to him. We don't know whether he was poisoned again very slowly. We know he was poisoned already in 2020. And whether this was another attempt, we don't know, or whether indeed it was the prison conditions that did kill him. We know that he spent almost a year of his entire 3 years in prison in one of these terrible isolation cells. One opposition figure who I spoke to, a Russian, he said he spent 30 minutes in one of those isolation cells. He said the conditions are terrible and it's basically like being tortured. And he said Navalny's organism may well have not held up.
Catherine, can I ask you, do you think this will now strengthen Putin's grip on power at home? Unfortunately, yes, it sends a very chilling signal to everyone. This is the first senior opposition figure that's died in jail. Everyone knew there was a risk, but for this to actually happen, it's still a shock. And this sends a signal to the Russian opposition figures who are already in jail, Ilya Yashin, Vladimir Kara-Murza, that they better shut up or they will meet the same fate. Yeah, it's a very frightening signal indeed. Let's talk about the timing of Navalny's death, just a month before national elections. Coincidence? It certainly doesn't look like it. I mean, just like it doesn't look like it was a coincidence that he was removed to the far north just after these billboards in Moscow appeared in which they were trying to get Russians to vote against Putin. Certainly, the Russian authorities are very sensitive right now, even though Putin has the election pretty much stitched up. Navalny had called for voters to protest against Putin by having a silent standing protest. He called for people to gather at 12 noon in protest of Putin at all polling stations across Russia. And it may be that they just had enough. We just don't know. But you can't get rid of the thought that somehow this is connected. Mm-hmm. If Alexei Navalny is dead, do you think his influence will continue? I mean, what are the prospects for any domestic opposition to President Putin? It's really a tragic moment because obviously Navalny himself, before he returned to Russia, before he was arrested and sent to jail, he had told his supporters that should he be killed, this is a sign we are strong. You should not give up.
But we can see in Moscow at the moment there are people coming out on the streets trying to lay flowers, but you can see just now how heavy the police presence is. There's really outnumbering anyone who wants to protest. The Moscow city authorities have already warned anyone against trying to demonstrate, saying that this would be a violation of the law. And really, unfortunately, Putin has so monopolized the political space, there's very little room for any opposition at all.
Journalist Catherine Belton, thank you so much for your insights and your time today.
Thank you for having me.
The US President Joe Biden says Alexei Navalny bravely stood up to corruption and violence. Biden added that he was outraged but not surprised by the reports of Navalny's death.
Reports of his death, if they're true, and I have no reason to believe they're not, Russian authorities are going to tell their own story. But make no mistake, Putin is responsible for Navalny's death. Putin is responsible. What has happened to Navalny is yet more proof of Putin's brutality. No one should be fooled, not in Russia, not at home, not anywhere in the world.
Other world leaders also expressed their sorrow and dismay at reports of Navalny's death.
He did nothing wrong. He was imprisoned for on fake charges. And even if nobody pulled the trigger, we know that it was the conditions that were created for him that killed him, and those conditions were the responsibility of President Vladimir Putin.
It's the whole world see a real face of Russia. The head of opposition, Navalny, Boris Nemtsov, and a lot of many Russians and other Russians who was against this regime already died. Killed, not died, killed.
Looking east of Munich to Ukraine and to Russia, I mean, it's the day Navalny died. I remember that a leading politician of the last government told me the evening before he was going back to Moscow, she visited him and said, "Don't do it. It will cost you your life," and he did it. And this is it's for me hard to find the right words. It's a tragedy, really, but that means that we have to stay strong also in the continuing fight supporting Ukraine and let Russia not win this terrible war.
We've heard the news, and this is actually quite tragic, and it shows the extent to which the Russian leadership is willing to go to try to silence the voice of the people, and it just shows us what kind of country we are dealing with, and it's a tragedy indeed.
Navalny's supporters are holding vigils in cities around the world. Our correspondent Hans Brandt spoke to me earlier from the Russian embassy here in Berlin.
Well, the people, much of the discussion here is going on in Russian. Much of the demonstration is being addressed in Russian. It's many young people from Russia who live here in Berlin or elsewhere in Germany. I spoke earlier, for instance, to a young woman who had just gone to the Russian embassy to renew her passport when she heard about the death of Navalny. She was almost in tears. There were a number of people here who have put down flowers and lit candles. The mood is solemn at times. People are in shock. But they're also saying that in some way their work has to continue. I spoke to one of the organizers of this protest, Yevgeny Yevgeny. He is from the Free Navalny movement here in Germany. Let's hear what he has to say.
We are here to express our not disappointment, but our commitment to what we are doing further on. That's very important because Putin's propaganda and Kremlin, especially before the elections in March, are trying to demoralize us and to stop our anti-propaganda projects that we're doing in Russia, from Europe, from the US. So, and that's why I'm more motivated to speak out. And of course, not only stand with the banners, but act out with Russian people against Putin, against the war.
So Yevgeny saying there that he's more motivated to speak out. So are people saying, you know, what are they saying about how Navalny's death will impact the pro-democracy movement in Russia? Are they feeling motivated?
Yes, indeed. I think you can't say that. Apart from the solemnness of the occasion, there is also a feeling of defiance and of anger here. And many of the speakers have been saying that Navalny's work has to continue, that Navalny's work will continue, that Vladimir Putin needs to be confronted with the responsibility for the death of Navalny and many others, including, obviously, the war in Ukraine. So, as you can hear, there is a sense of defiance and a determination to continue with resistance to the Putin regime.
Hans Brandt in front of the Russian embassy in Berlin. Thanks so much, Hans. And news of Alexei Navalny's death emerged as Germany and Ukraine signed a long-term security pact here in Berlin. The German government has also promised more cash and military equipment to help Kyiv fight the Russian invasion.
Back in Berlin, Volodymyr Zelensky and Olaf Scholz kept the small talk brief amid tight security. The Ukrainian president in town to sign a historic security agreement, underlining Germany's support for Kiev. But as the media waited to hear from the men, news broke of Kremlin critic Alexei Navalny's death. That's very depressing. I met Navalny here in Berlin when he was trying to recover from the poisoning attack in Germany. And I also talked to him about the great courage it takes to go back to the country. And he's probably now paid for that courage with his life. Returning to the pre-planned schedule, Scholz said it was a show of solidarity. 2 years after the start of this horrible war, we are sending a crystal clear message to the Russian president. We will not waver in our support for Ukraine. We continue to stand with the Ukrainian people. President Zelensky welcomed the agreement and insisted it was about more than the fate of Ukraine. This is a very important document. It's not just about a new direction in our cooperation. It's about Germany wanting to protect normality in Europe and the world, because war must never become part of everyday life for any people in the world. The 10-year-long guarantee is intended to deepen military and economic support. But despite the warm smiles, it crucially does not include a NATO-style pledge to come to Ukraine's defence.